Good day everyone. In this video, our learning objectives is first, differentiate null and alternative hypothesis. Second, state the null and alternative hypothesis given a problem. Third, list down the different non-parametric statistical tests for testing the null hypothesis. And lastly, compare and contrast the different non-parametric statistical tests. Generation of the hypothesis is the beginning of a scientific process. It refers to a supposition based on reasoning and evidence. The researcher examines it through observations and experiments, which then provides facts and forecasts possible outcomes. The hypothesis can be inductive or deductive, simple or complex, null or alternative. First, we need to understand the both terms. So what is null hypothesis? A null hypothesis is a statistical hypothesis in which there is no significant difference exists between the set of variables. It is the original or default statement with no effect, often represented by H0. It is always the hypothesis that is tested. It denotes the certain value of population parameters such as mean, S, and P. A null hypothesis can be rejected, but it cannot be accepted on the basis of a single test. What is alternative hypothesis? A statistical hypothesis used in hypothesis testing which states that there is a significant difference between the set of variables. It is often referred to as the hypothesis other than the null hypothesis, often denoted by H1. The acceptance of alternative hypothesis depends on the rejection of the null hypothesis. Until and unless null hypothesis is rejected, an alternative hypothesis cannot be accepted. The important points of differences between null and alternative hypothesis are explained as one, meaning a null hypothesis is a statement in which there is no relationship between two variables, and an alternative variables is a statement that's simply the inverse of the null hypothesis. For example, there is some statistical significance between two measured phenomena. 2. What is it? A null hypothesis is that what the researcher tries to disprove, whereas an alternative hypothesis is what the researchers want to prove. 3. Represents. A null hypothesis represents new observation effect, whereas an alternative hypothesis reflects some observed effects. 4. Acceptance. If the null hypothesis is accepted, no changes will be made in the options or actions. Conversely, if the alternative hypothesis is accepted, it will result in the changes in the opinions or actions. 5th, testing. As null hypothesis refers to population parameters, the testing is indirect and implicit. On the other hand, the alternative hypothesis indicates sample statistic wherein the testing is direct and explicit. 6th, denoted by a null hypothesis is labeled as H0, while an alternative hypothesis is represented by H1. 7. Mathematical formulation. The mathematical formulation of a null hypothesis is an equal sign, but for an alternative hypothesis is not equal to sign. 8. In null hypothesis, the observations are the outcome of change, whereas in the case of the alternative hypothesis, the observations are an outcome of real effect. So, there are two outcomes of a statistical test. For example, first, a null hypothesis is rejected, an alternative hypothesis is accepted. Second, null hypothesis is accepted on the basis of the evidence in simple terms. A null hypothesis is just opposite of the alternative hypothesis. Next, we are going to state the null and alternative hypothesis given in a problem. A researcher thinks that if a knee surgery patient goes to physical therapy twice a week, instead of 3 times, the recovery period will be longer. Average recovery times for knee surgery patients is 8.2 weeks. So now, let's construct our HO or null hypothesis and H1 our alternative hypothesis. Um, H0 is equal to average recovery times for knee surgery is equal to 8.2 weeks, while our alternative hypothesis, average recovery times for knee surgery patients is not equal to 8.2 weeks. Next, let's proceed to the different non-parametric statistical tests for testing the null hypothesis. Let's define what is a non-parametric test. A non-parametric test are the mathematical methods used in statistical hypothesis testing, which do not make assumptions about the frequency distribution of variables that are to be evaluated. The non-parametric experiment is used when there are skewed data, and it comprises techniques that do not depend on data pertaining to any particular distribution. Non-parametric t-test, whether a few assumptions in the given population are uncertain, we use non-parametric tests, which are also considered parametric counterparts, when data are not distributed normally, or when they are on an ordinal level of measurement. We have to use non-parametric tests for analysis. The basic rule is to use parametric t-test for normally distributed data and a non-parametric test for skewed data. Next, a non-parametric paired t-test. The paired sample t-test is used to match two mean scores, and these scores came from the same group. Paired sample t-test is used when variables are independent and have two levels, and those levels are repeated measures. Lastly, let's compare and contrast the different types of non-parametric test. First, Kruskal-Wallis test. Kruskal-Wallis test is used to compare the continuous outcome in greater than two independent samples. Null hypothesis. K population medians are equal. Test statistics. If N is the total sample size, K is the number of comparison groups. Rj is the sum of the ranks in the jth group, and Nj is the sample size in the jth group. Then, the test statistic H is given by decision rule. Reject the null hypothesis. HO if H is greater than or equal critical value. Next is sign test. The sign test is used to compare the continuous outcome in the paired samples or the two matched samples. Null hypothesis median difference should be 0. Test statistic. The test statistic of the sign test is the smaller of the number of the positive or negative sign. Decision rule. Reject the null hypothesis if the smaller of number of the positive or the negative signs are less than or equal to the critical value from the table. Third, Mann-Whitney test. Mann-Whitney U-test is used to compare the continuous outcomes in the two independent samples. Null hypothesis that two populations should be equal. Test statistic if R1 and R2 are the sum of the ranks in group 1 and group 2 respectively, then the test statistic U is the smaller of. Decision rule. Reject the null hypothesis if the test statistic U is less than or equal to the critical value from that table. Lastly, the Wilkinson sign rank test. A Wilkinson sign rank test is used to compare the continuous outcome in the two matched samples or the paired samples. The null hypothesis median difference should be 0, while the test statistic W is defined as the smaller of W positive or W negative, where W positive and W negative are the sums of the positive and the negative ranks of the different scores. Decision rule. Reject the null hypothesis if the test statistics W is less than or equal to the critical value. Thank you for watching my video. I hope it is clear to you all our learning objectives for this lesson. That's all. Thank you.